Vorwärts, achtet auf die Flanken.
Verstanden, wir rücken vor.
January 17th, 1943. The Eastern Front. Dawn breaks over a landscape sculpted in white. Snowdrifts hang like frozen clouds above the wreckage of a shattered village. The wind bites through tattered uniforms, howling across shattered streets where abandoned tanks lie half-buried in ice. Every step crunches on frost-hardened ground, each breath visible in the frigid air. Soviet soldiers huddle against makeshift barricades, rifles clutched, eyes scanning the horizon. Across the frozen plains, German panzers struggle through a slick of ice and snow, their engines groaning as metal bites the frozen earth. Supplies vanish beneath blizzards, boots slip, artillery freezes, and radios crackle with distorted signals. The ice does not choose sides. It slows, it punishes, it reshapes every move. Here, the war is measured not only in bullets and bombs, but in frostbite, exhaustion, and the will to survive. The Axis had planned for conquest. The Allies had planned for endurance. But nature had its own strategy. And in the cold silence of January 1943, it would decide the fate of millions. The frozen ground trembles with the weight of history. By 1942, the world had descended into total war. Europe was carved in two. The Axis powers, led by Nazi Germany, had reached their peak of expansion. Across the continent, armies moved with precision and brutality, reshaping borders and breaking resistance. France had fallen the previous year, Belgium and the Netherlands occupied, and the Luftwaffe dominated the skies. Across the Mediterranean, Italian forces struggled, while North Africa became a proving ground for armored warfare. The Soviet Union, massive and resource-rich, bore the brunt of Germany's eastern ambitions. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June 1941, had driven deep into Soviet territory. Cities burned, villages vanished, and millions of soldiers and civilians suffered under the relentless advance. The Wehrmacht moved with unprecedented speed, relying on mechanized units, close air support, and coordinated logistics. Yet, as the front lines stretched, cracks appeared, supply lines faltered. Winter approached, and the Germans, trained and equipped for rapid conquest, were suddenly vulnerable to the harsh Russian climate. Meanwhile, the Allies in the West were still consolidating. Britain, battered by the Blitz and the strain of defending global interests, faced a war on multiple fronts with limited resources. The United States, drawn in a conflict after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, began mobilizing with staggering speed, but its forces were inexperienced, and supply chains were stretched across oceans. Convoys crossed the Atlantic under constant threat from U-boats, ice forming on decks as crews battled both the sea and the cold. In North Africa, the back-and-forth struggle between Rommel's Afrika Korps and the British Eighth Army exposed the difficulties of desert warfare. Successes were fleeting, gains often reversed in weeks. Logistics proved as decisive as tactics. Fuel, water, and supplies were never guaranteed. Soldiers learned that harsh environments could be as deadly as the enemy's guns. Across Europe and Africa, the pattern was clear. Axis forces advanced with initial brilliance, yet overextension, poor intelligence, and misjudged terrain created vulnerabilities. Back in the East, winter 1941-42 had demonstrated the lethal power of cold. German troops, unprepared for sub-zero temperatures, suffered frostbite and mechanical failures. Tanks froze in place. Guns jammed. Even the strongest soldiers succumbed to exposure. Soviet forces, hardened by months of survival, exploited these weaknesses. Ice, snow, and frozen rivers became both barrier and weapon. By the end of 1942, the stage was set. The Axis had reached its operational limits, while the Allies, adapting to the unforgiving terrain, prepared for a counteroffensive that would test every facet of endurance, strategy, and innovation. The war was no longer just about movement and firepower. Geography, weather, and human resilience had joined the battle. From the snows of the East to the icy convoys of the Arctic, the elements shaped every campaign. Commanders quickly realized that victory would not come from strategy alone, but from mastering conditions that no map could convey, no report could fully capture. As January 1943 approached, the Axis found themselves trapped between overextended supply lines, exhausted troops, and the merciless cold. The Allies, slowly learning from both defeats and minor victories, prepared to exploit these weaknesses. Every frozen river, every blizzard, every ice-covered road became a weapon of opportunity. Nature itself had begun to favor those who could endure, adapt, and persevere. And it was here, in the bitter heart of winter, where human determination collided with the relentless force of ice, that the stage was set for a turning point that would change the course of the war forever. January 1943 marked a pivotal moment in the war's trajectory. After 2 years of relentless fighting, the Axis momentum had begun to falter. On the Eastern Front, the German advance had stalled outside Stalingrad. The city, reduced to rubble, became a death trap of urban warfare, with snow and ice filling the streets like a silent accomplice. The Wehrmacht, once the image of unstoppable force, now faced shortages of ammunition, fuel, and winter clothing. Soldiers marched through knee-deep snow, their breath crystallizing in the frozen air. Supply convoys slipped on icebound roads, sometimes halting altogether, leaving entire battalions exposed to both the Soviet army and the elements. The Soviets, having endured the initial onslaught of 1941, had reorganized. Under generals like Zhukov and Vasilevsky, they learned to turn the ice and snow into tools of war. Frozen rivers became defensive barriers, while blizzards masked troop movements. Scouts and infantry trained for winter operations outperformed German units, who had underestimated the cold's lethality. By the start of 1943, the Red Army was not just surviving. It was preparing for counteroffensives that would exploit every frozen mile of terrain. In North Africa, the Axis faced a different challenge. The desert, though not icy, presented logistical extremes comparable to winter in the East. Rommel's forces, overextended and under constant pressure from British and Commonwealth troops, struggled with supply lines stretching from the ports of Tunisia to forward positions in the desert. The Allies, learning from earlier failures at Tobruk and Gazala, began implementing meticulous planning, ensuring that fuel, rations, and reinforcements arrived reliably. These lessons in logistics would prove invaluable when winter campaigns in Europe tested the same principles under ice and snow. Meanwhile, the Arctic convoys, delivering supplies from Britain and America to the Soviet Union, faced their own frozen gauntlets. Ships threaded through ice-laden waters under the threat of German U-boats and Luftwaffe attacks. Decks froze, engines strained against the cold, and crews endured constant frostbite. Yet every crate of food, weapon, and ammunition brought across these perilous seas strengthened the Soviet front, proving that ice could be both obstacle and lifeline. Back in Europe, Allied intelligence worked tirelessly to map Axis vulnerabilities. Reconnaissance planes braved freezing temperatures, photographing supply lines and troop concentrations. Signals intelligence intercepted German communications, frozen in coded transmission bursts, revealing where forces were overextended. The Allies now understood that victory would require more than brute force. It demanded preparation, patience, and the ability to harness the environment as a weapon. By late January 1943, strategic coordination between the Western Allies and the Soviets began to bear fruit. While the Soviets amassed forces for encirclement operations in the east, the British and Americans planned offensives across the Mediterranean. Each theater had its own harsh challenges: mountains, rivers, snowstorms, but the principle was the same: exploit the enemy's weaknesses, survive the elements, and strike decisively. Ice, snow, and freezing temperatures were no longer passive obstacles. They were integrated into operational planning, turning nature into an unexpected ally. The human dimension also became crucial. Troops trained for extreme cold learned to dig snow shelters, maintain frozen equipment, and ration supplies effectively. Commanders understood that morale, adaptability, and endurance were as decisive as firepower. The suffering endured in 1941 and 1942 had forged armies capable of turning harsh winters into strategic advantage. By early 1943, the Allies had mastered both preparation and timing. In this frozen crucible, the war's trajectory began to shift. The Axis, overconfident and ill-prepared for the full winter's wrath, faced attrition not only from opposing armies, but from the unforgiving terrain itself. The Allies, patient and disciplined, moved deliberately, letting frost and ice carve the path for victory. Every icy road, every frozen river, and every snowbound village became a theater where strategy met survival, and where the balance of power started to tilt irrevocably. As winter deepened, the stage was set for decisive action. Battles would be fought not just with guns and tanks, but with shovels, skis, and sheer human resilience. In the frozen heart of 1943, the Allies' understanding of ice would become the invisible hand shaping the collapse of the Axis dominance. The war in 1943 was fought not only on maps, but on frozen bodies. Soldiers endured conditions that defied conventional training. On the Eastern Front, Red Army infantry tramped through snowdrifts that sometimes reached waist height, their boots soaked and frozen within hours. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and lives, often faster than bullets. German soldiers, initially confident, discovered that discipline alone could not combat sub-zero nights. Starvation and cold became allies of the Soviet defense, sapping morale and slowing advances. In the Mediterranean and Arctic theaters, the story was no different. Sailors on convoys crossing ice-choked seas faced decks slick with frozen spray, while supply drivers navigated treacherous mountain passes in northern Italy, wheels locked in ice, engines strained to breaking. Survival depended on endurance, creativity, and adaptation. Soldiers learned to improvise: snow shelters, makeshift stoves, and thawing equipment in small fires. The human body itself became a weapon of perseverance. Those who endured the cold gained a psychological edge over those who faltered. In 1943, endurance was not just survival. It was a strategic advantage. Frozen landscapes reshaped every battlefield. Rivers that in summer were barriers could now be crossed as ice bridges, turning defensive lines into vulnerable positions. In Stalingrad, Soviet forces used the frozen Don and Volga to encircle German units, exploiting mobility that ice unexpectedly afforded. Mountain passes in Italy became choke points where armored columns ground to a halt, slowed by snow and black ice. Commanders adapted quickly. Artillery positions were moved to frozen hills, anti-tank obstacles buried under snow, and ski-mounted units used for rapid flanking maneuvers. Convoys and supply lines were routed over frozen rivers and snow-packed roads, often under the cover of blizzards to conceal movements. Tactical planning had to account for ice as both terrain and weapon. Units that ignored its influence were immobilized, trapped, or annihilated. Success depended on observing the environment as closely as the enemy, using cold itself to shape engagements. By 1943, the most effective forces were those who fought the ice as skillfully as they fought men. Technology met its trial in the frost. Tanks, trucks, and artillery designed for temperate climates struggled under sub-zero conditions. Engines refused to start. Lubricants froze. Radios and communication lines cracked under ice. Both Allies and Axis forces had to innovate rapidly. Soviets deployed modified T-34 tanks with improved cold weather gear and fuel additives to prevent freezing. German mechanized units experimented with portable stoves and insulation for crew compartments, but supply shortages limited effectiveness. Small arms and artillery required constant maintenance. Even a jammed rifle could decide the life or death of a unit during a blizzard. In northern Italy, Allied engineers constructed ice-strengthened bridges, allowing supply convoys to bypass impassable mountain roads. In the Arctic, convoys relied on hull reinforcements and de-icing equipment to reach Murmansk. Across every front, technology was redefined, not in firepower alone, but in adaptation to extreme environments. Success was determined by who could keep machines moving when the ice threatened to immobilize them, turning mechanical reliability into a battlefield advantage. Commanders on both sides quickly realized that ice was an unpredictable subordinate. Decisions once straightforward became precarious when snow and frost could immobilize troops or render artillery useless. Soviet generals, most notably Georgy Zhukov, leveraged the environment as a force multiplier. Orders were timed to coincide with blizzards or frozen rivers, masking troop movements and amplifying the impact of offensives. In contrast, German commanders often underestimated winter's toll. Friedrich Paulus at Stalingrad clung to offensive schedules despite failing supplies and frozen equipment, a rigid adherence that compounded disaster. Across the Mediterranean, Allied leaders like Bernard Montgomery emphasized meticulous preparation. Troops trained in alpine conditions, supply chains reinforced, and intelligence continuously updated to anticipate icy obstacles. Leadership in 1943 required more than tactical brilliance. It demanded flexibility, foresight, and a deep understanding of nature's influence. Those who adapted preserved lives, maintained momentum, and exploited the enemy's vulnerability, while those who resisted adaptation paid a steep human and strategic cost. The Axis powers, once the embodiment of mechanized warfare, struggled to contend with the freezing grip of winter. German supply lines, stretched hundreds of kilometers across frozen plains, became choke points. Fuel ran low, ammunition stockpiles froze, morale deteriorated. Soldiers, already fatigued from relentless campaigns, found themselves trapped in villages turned prisons by snow and ice. Italian divisions, poorly equipped for cold weather, relied heavily on German support that increasingly failed. Even Rommel, famed for his tactical brilliance in North Africa, encountered logistical paralysis when mountain passes iced over during campaigns in Sicily and northern Italy. Across the Eastern Front, Soviet counterattacks exploited every frozen river, every snow-laden forest. The enemy's strength, their mobility, coordination, and tactical audacity, was neutralized by conditions beyond their control. In 1943, ice became an invisible general on the battlefield, turning Axis confidence into hesitation, and hesitation into catastrophe. Winter 1943 revealed the profound interplay between human endurance and political will. Reports of frozen corpses, frostbitten limbs, and exhausted convoys filtered back to capitals, shaping morale at home and influencing leadership decisions. In Moscow, propaganda emphasized Soviet resilience, portraying the harsh winter as a proving ground that hardened soldiers and civilians alike. Allied leaders used similar narratives to rally troops and maintain public support for prolonged campaigns. Conversely, Axis governments struggled to mask losses exacerbated by cold, and civilian populations began to question the competence of their military leadership. Politically, the ability to endure and adapt to frozen conditions became as symbolic as any battlefield victory. The Allies' survival through ice and snow bolstered confidence in the eventual triumph of the coalition, while Axis failures in winter conditions foreshadowed cracks in the war's political and strategic foundations. The frozen landscapes of 1943 were thus battlegrounds not only of weapons, but of morale, ideology, and perception, where human resilience intertwined with the course of history. January 1943 on the Eastern Front was a battlefield unlike any before. Stalingrad, a city once vibrant with industry and culture, had been reduced to a frozen labyrinth of rubble. Ice coated the skeletal frames of buildings, filling shattered streets with treacherous patches of frost that made every movement perilous. The German Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, had been encircled by Soviet forces in Operation Uranus. What had begun as a series of calculated attacks now became a battle of survival against both the enemy and the elements. The encirclement was methodical. Soviet forces, expertly trained for winter warfare, advanced over the frozen Don and Volga rivers, their movements masked by blizzards. Infantry and armored units coordinated with sniper teams and artillery positions hidden in ice-laden ruins. German units, accustomed to rapid maneuvers and mechanized warfare, found their tanks stuck in snow, engines freezing, and roads impassable. Supplies dwindled. Radio communications faltered as frost interfered with wiring and batteries, leaving field commanders isolated in the vast expanse of snow and ruin. By mid-January, temperatures had dropped below minus 30 degrees Celsius in some sectors. Frostbite became a silent killer, claiming more soldiers than Soviet bullets in certain units. Men wrote desperate letters to families, unaware that few would survive to see them delivered. Despite the adversity, German officers attempted to maintain discipline and morale. Paulus insisted on holding positions, believing relief efforts from Field Marshal von Manstein could break the encirclement. Yet the ice and snow had turned conventional strategy into a gamble. Supply convoys sent to aid the Sixth Army were bogged down in snowdrifts or destroyed by Soviet artillery. Horses, trucks, and even mechanized sleds failed to deliver ammunition and food consistently. The environment had become a weapon wielded with precision by the Soviets. Every frozen street and icebound road was a line of defense as formidable as any trench. Soviet commanders recognized that endurance could triumph over strength. Troops were rotated efficiently, given small rations that could sustain them without slowing the advance. Engineers constructed ice bridges and cleared snow-covered obstacles to maintain momentum. Air support from the Red Air Force, although hampered by frost-covered runways, provided reconnaissance and intermittent bombing that further stressed the encircled Germans. The weather itself aided the Soviets. Blizzards obscured movements and prevented effective counterattacks. By the third week of January, the German perimeter was shrinking steadily, compressed by the cold, the ice, and the relentless Soviet pressure. Meanwhile, in North Africa, another theater demonstrated the strategic impact of environmental extremes. Though not icy in the conventional sense, the winter rains and early frosts of Tunisia created conditions that mirrored the immobilization seen in the east. Axis units, overextended across deserts and mountains, struggled with supply lines interrupted by mud and ice-forming temperatures at higher altitudes. The British Eighth Army, under Bernard Montgomery, capitalized on this by timing offensives when the ground was passable for their mechanized units, but bogged down for Rommel's forces. Tanks and artillery moved with precision, while German columns became mired in mud and early ice. Every tactical decision was amplified by environmental awareness, highlighting that in 1943, victory relied not just on firepower, but on exploiting the harshness of terrain. Back in Stalingrad, the human dimension intensified the climax. Starving German troops scavenged for food amid frozen ruins, while frostbitten and malnourished soldiers struggled to operate artillery or defend barricades. Soviet infantry, despite suffering under similar conditions, were reinforced regularly by reserves ferried across frozen rivers and snow-packed roads. The battle became a test of collective endurance. Leaders like Zhukov coordinated complex pincer movements, encircling entire battalions and forcing surrenders. German morale, already strained by cold, hunger, and hopeless positions, began to collapse. Letters found later from soldiers spoke of despair, noting that frost seemed as lethal as any bullet. The psychological effect of winter, combined with tactical pressure, transformed Stalingrad from a brutal urban fight into a complete encirclement where survival itself became the measure of defeat. The Axis failure at Stalingrad did not happen overnight. It was a combination of miscalculation, overstretched supply lines, and the unrelenting force of ice and snow. The Germans had underestimated both the Soviet ability to endure and the impact of winter on mechanized warfare. Attempts at breakout or relief, whether by ground or air, were thwarted by frozen rivers, snow-packed roads, and the persistent Soviet blockade. By late January, the Sixth Army situation had become untenable. The ice had dictated the pace, the tempo, and ultimately the outcome. In parallel, Arctic convoys to the Soviet Union reinforced the Red Army's position, despite attacks from German U-boats and Luftwaffe bombers. Ships groaned under the weight of supplies, decks slick with ice, while crews fought frostbite and exhaustion. Each crate of ammunition or food delivered across these frozen waters strengthened the Soviet hand in Stalingrad and demonstrated the strategic interplay of nature and warfare. The ice was not passive. It was both obstacle and conduit, slowing the enemy while facilitating the survival of those prepared to endure it. Across Europe, the lesson became undeniable. In 1943, the war could be won or lost not solely by soldiers, tanks, or planes, but by mastery over environment. Winter, ice, and frozen terrain shaped operational planning, dictated logistics, and tested human endurance. In Stalingrad, in Tunisia, and on Arctic convoys, the Allies' preparation for extreme conditions amplified their strategic advantage, while the Axis underestimation of these factors accelerated their collapse. The frozen months of early 1943 were more than a backdrop. They were decisive actors in the war, dictating who would survive, who would retreat, and who would ultimately surrender. By the end of January, the ice had spoken. The German Sixth Army was trapped, its fate sealed not only by Soviet strategy, but by the relentless, unyielding grip of winter itself. Across other theaters, Axis forces faced similar constraints, while the Allies exploited frozen terrain with discipline, ingenuity, and endurance. The stage was now set for the next phase of the 1943 campaigns, where ice would continue to shape strategy, morale, and the eventual collapse of Axis ambitions. By February 1943, the frozen grip of winter had transformed from obstacle to decisive instrument. On the Eastern Front, the German Sixth Army remained encircled at Stalingrad, its situation deteriorating by the day. Supplies had all but vanished. Temperatures lingered at minus 30 degrees Celsius, freezing rations, weapons, and the morale of soldiers clinging to makeshift shelters. Paulus men, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, now huddled in ruins, rationing what little remained of their food and fuel. Soviet forces, having mastered winter warfare, maintained relentless pressure. Each day, Soviet artillery pounded positions while infantry advanced over frozen streets, taking advantage of crumbling defenses and the mobility granted by ice-packed ruins. The Soviets orchestrated a systematic tightening of the encirclement. Ski-mounted units and engineers cleared snow to facilitate surprise maneuvers, while frozen rivers allowed rapid redeployment of reserves. Blizzards concealed troop movements, masking the arrival of fresh reinforcements. The German commanders' repeated requests for airdrop supplies were met with limited success. Parachutes froze, and planes risked catastrophic losses, landing on snowbound airstrips. The combination of attrition, frostbite, and starvation forced surrender. By February 2nd, 1943, Paulus capitulated. Over 90,000 German troops were taken prisoner, the largest single surrender in German military history up to that point. ICE had acted not as a passive element, but as a force that magnified Soviet strategic advantage and accelerated the Axis collapse. Further west, the Mediterranean theater displayed similar lessons in winter warfare. In northern Italy, Allied forces confronted Axis defenses fortified in mountain passes and valleys, often iced over and treacherously slick. Mechanized columns navigated frozen roads, while engineers reinforced temporary bridges over snow-choked streams. The Germans, overextended and ill-prepared for harsh winter conditions, were forced to withdraw from positions they could not reliably supply. Each icy pass that the Allies secured allowed artillery and infantry to advance, exploiting the Axis' inability to move efficiently. The ice acted as both barrier and lever, slowing the enemy while facilitating disciplined offensive operations. By March, entire German battalions had retreated under pressure, abandoning equipment and fortifications that became frozen monuments to miscalculation. North Africa, though devoid of Siberian temperatures, illustrated that environmental extremes could still dictate outcomes. Early 1943 brought rare winter storms across Tunisia, producing ice on roads and mud that immobilized vehicles. Rommel's Afrika Korps, already stretched thin by months of desert campaigns, found retreat and resupply increasingly impossible. British and American forces, having prepared for adverse conditions, advanced systematically, turning what would have been minor delays into decisive advantages. In each theater, the lessons were consistent. Those who adapted to frozen and extreme conditions survived and thrived. Those who did not succumbed. The strategic impact extended beyond individual battles. In Stalingrad, the surrender of the Sixth Army shattered the myth of German invincibility. Across the Eastern Front, Soviet forces capitalized on momentum, launching counteroffensives along the Don and Donets rivers, exploiting frozen terrain to encircle smaller German units. The Wehrmacht, forced to consolidate, could no longer sustain forward momentum. Commanders who had relied on speed and mechanization now found themselves hindered by ice, snow, and frozen rivers. The human and mechanical resources that had fueled early successes were now liabilities in the unforgiving winter landscape. Logistical ingenuity became a deciding factor. The Allies' mastery over icebound rivers, snow-covered mountain roads, and frozen coastal convoys allowed sustained offensives. Arctic convoys, though battered by German submarines and Luftwaffe attacks, delivered vital supplies that reinforced the Eastern Front. Each crate of ammunition, every barrel of fuel, became more than sustenance. It was a strategic instrument that allowed operations to continue where Axis forces faltered. Winter had amplified the consequences of logistical discipline, making planning and endurance more decisive than numerical superiority alone. In the human dimension, ice intensified both heroism and tragedy. Soviet soldiers, marching over frozen rivers and snow-filled ruins, endured exhaustion that would have broken less resilient forces. German troops, encased in frostbite and dwindling rations, faced not only the enemy, but the relentless power of nature. Small skirmishes often became life-or-death struggles, with frostbite, snow, and exposure claiming as many as combat itself. The psychological impact of fighting under frozen skies proved pivotal. The ability to endure suffering without losing cohesion determined the pace and outcome of campaigns. By March and April 1943, the pattern was clear across multiple theaters. Axis forces struggled to maintain cohesion and supply, while the Allies, patient, disciplined, and prepared, leveraged ice, snow, and winter conditions to their advantage. The culmination of these factors, strategic planning, tactical execution, logistical preparation, and human endurance, constituted what would later be remembered as the Allied miracle of 1943. Ice had not simply slowed the war. It had reshaped it, dictating which operations succeeded, which failed, and which armies would be decisively weakened. The winter of 1943 transformed the dynamics of the conflict. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union transitioned from defensive operations to full-scale offensives, reclaiming lost territory and forcing the Wehrmacht onto the strategic defensive. In Italy, Allied forces advanced through mountain passes once thought impassable, while German troops retreated under the pressure of terrain, weather, and superior planning. Across the Arctic, convoys ensured continued Soviet resilience. In every theater, the interplay between human resolve, tactical adaptation, and the merciless force of frozen nature determined outcomes that conventional warfare alone could not dictate. The frozen months had revealed a profound truth. Victory in 1943 would go to those who could endure, adapt, and exploit the environment itself. By the time spring thawed Europe's rivers and roads, the Axis powers were strategically weakened, their forces depleted, and their momentum irreversibly stalled. The Allies had learned a lesson that would echo for the rest of the war. In 1943, ice was as lethal as any weapon, and those who mastered it could achieve miracles. By the spring of 1943, the icy campaigns of the previous months had left an indelible mark on the course of World War II. The German Sixth Army's surrender at Stalingrad was more than a military disaster. It was a psychological and strategic turning point. Over 90,000 troops had been captured, the majority of them frozen, starving, and exhausted. Entire units ceased to exist as fighting forces. German generals, once confident in the invincibility of their mechanized armies, faced the stark reality that environmental miscalculations could nullify years of planning. Stalin, in a carefully orchestrated message to the Soviet people, proclaimed the victory as a demonstration of endurance, discipline, and patriotic resolve. Across the Eastern Front, Soviet forces capitalized on momentum. Encirclements at Stalingrad had shown that Axis supply lines were vulnerable to ice and winter conditions, and Red Army commanders began coordinating counteroffensives along frozen rivers and snowbound plains. Cities previously occupied by the Wehrmacht, such as Kharkov and Rostov, were gradually reclaimed. Equipment abandoned by retreating German units, tanks, artillery, and vehicles frozen in place, was repaired or repurposed, further bolstering Soviet capabilities. The winter campaigns had shifted the initiative firmly into Allied hands. The Axis no longer dictated the pace of operations. In Italy, the combination of icy mountain passes and well-prepared Allied logistics had forced German units into defensive positions they had not anticipated. Retreating troops abandoned fortifications, vehicles, and stores of fuel and ammunition. The Allies, moving with disciplined coordination, seized key positions that had been considered natural choke points. Tactical victories in the mountains, though smaller in scale than Stalingrad, demonstrated that environmental mastery could amplify operational effectiveness. Ice, snow, and extreme conditions had transformed from obstacles into force multipliers, and the Allies were the first to exploit them systematically. Even the Arctic convoys had an outsized impact. Despite repeated attacks from U-boats and Luftwaffe bombers, supply lines to the Soviet Union remained operational. Frozen decks and ice-laden engines taxed crews to their limits. Yet every ton of fuel, weaponry, and food delivered strengthened Soviet resistance. Historians later estimated that these convoys were responsible for sustaining millions of troops during the winter offensives, allowing the Red Army to maintain pressure on frozen fronts while Germany struggled with logistics. The ice-laden seas, once considered impassable or secondary, became lifelines, illustrating the crucial intersection of environment and strategy. The combined effect of these campaigns was staggering. The Axis powers suffered not only personnel losses, but a strategic depletion of resources. German mechanized divisions, once the spearhead of Blitzkrieg, had lost vehicles to immobilization and abandonment. Fuel and ammunition stockpiles froze and were lost, reducing the Wehrmacht's capacity for sustained operations. Morale plummeted across all fronts. Soldiers who had survived the frostbite, starvation, and endless snow realized that their leaders had underestimated the power of ice. Across the Mediterranean, Eastern Front, and Arctic theaters, Axis forces were forced into reactive strategies, abandoning bold offensives for defensive withdrawals dictated by terrain and weather rather than military initiative. The Allies, by contrast, emerged strengthened. Lessons learned from previous winters had been integrated into training, logistics, and planning. Soldiers were equipped with winter gear. Engineers reinforced supply lines against snow and ice, and commanders timed operations to exploit frozen terrain. Where Axis forces faltered, the Allies capitalized, turning environmental challenges into tactical and strategic advantages. For the first time, the war demonstrated that mastery of natural conditions could outweigh numerical parity or even technological superiority. The winter of 1943 also reshaped perceptions of warfare. Ice and snow had proven themselves as decisive actors, shaping victories, surrenders, and the psychological landscape of armies. Reports from the Eastern Front emphasized that frostbite, exhaustion, and immobilized vehicles had been as lethal as any German gun. In Italy, frozen mountain roads dictated the timing of entire offensives. In the Arctic, frozen seas determined the flow of vital supplies. Across all theaters, the Allies had demonstrated the importance of preparation, resilience, and environmental awareness, lessons that would reverberate through the remainder of the war. The frozen months had, in essence, redrawn the balance of power. Axis forces, stretched thin and exposed, would no longer dictate campaigns with the same confidence. The Allies, having survived and thrived in conditions that had broken their enemies, seized the initiative. As the ice began to thaw with the coming of spring, the consequences of winter 1943 were clear. The Axis dominance had been broken, and the path toward eventual Allied victory had been irrevocably shaped by the unforgiving grip of ice. The winter campaigns of 1943 left consequences that reached far beyond immediate battlefield outcomes. The surrender of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad reverberated across Europe, shaking both military and civilian confidence in the Axis powers. In Berlin, news of the defeat was met with disbelief and unease. The myth of German invincibility, built on rapid victories and mechanized superiority, had been shattered. Soldiers returning from other fronts were haunted by the frozen streets and empty villages of the Eastern Front, aware that even the most disciplined units could succumb to nature itself. For the Axis, morale deteriorated at the same pace as supplies, while command decisions became increasingly cautious, reactive, and constrained by fear of repeating the disasters of winter 1943. For the Allies, the effect was the opposite. In Moscow, London, and Washington, news of victories achieved under brutal winter conditions became a symbol of resilience and ingenuity. Propaganda emphasized the ability of troops to endure extreme cold, navigate frozen landscapes, and exploit the enemy's weaknesses. Soviet publications portrayed the Red Army as a force both disciplined and adaptive, capable of turning ice and snow into instruments of triumph. In the Mediterranean and Arctic theaters, Allied forces were similarly celebrated for overcoming environmental challenges while maintaining operational momentum. Across the coalition, public confidence in eventual victory strengthened, morale soared, and political leaders could point to tangible examples of the war being turned in their favor. The human cost, however, was staggering. In Stalingrad alone, tens of thousands perished not from combat, but from frostbite, starvation, and exhaustion. Survivors bore the physical scars of frozen limbs and the psychological trauma of months spent in snowbound ruins, facing death not only from bullets but from the relentless cold. Across Europe, soldiers on all sides suffered under similar conditions. The Mediterranean mountains, frozen Arctic seas, and snow-laden plains of Russia exposed combatants to hardships that tested the limits of endurance. These losses, while sometimes invisible in traditional battle reports, had a lasting impact on armies' ability to fight, their cohesion, and their morale. The war of 1943 was defined as much by human resilience as by tactical brilliance. Strategically, the consequences were transformative. Axis forces, weakened by overextension, resource depletion, and environmental miscalculations, were forced onto the defensive. The Eastern Front, once dominated by rapid German advances, now saw the Red Army initiating counteroffensives that would reclaim vast territories. In Italy, frozen mountain passes had accelerated Allied advances, weakening German defensive positions and opening pathways for subsequent spring campaigns. Arctic convoys, maintained despite extreme conditions, ensured that Soviet forces could continue operations without interruption. In every theater, the Allies' ability to endure and exploit the frozen environment translated into operational and strategic momentum. The frozen months of 1943 became the hinge on which subsequent victories would pivot. Politically, the winter campaigns reinforced Allied cohesion and legitimacy. Leaders used the narrative of endurance to rally civilian populations, emphasizing that survival and adaptation under extreme conditions were as decisive as victories in battle. Axis governments, by contrast, struggled to conceal the scale of their defeats and the vulnerability of their armies to winter. In Germany, Italy, and occupied territories, awareness of these failures undermined confidence in leadership and created fractures that would later widen as the war progressed. Nature, in the form of ice and extreme cold, had become a decisive actor in the war's political as well as military theater. By the conclusion of winter 1943, the implications were undeniable. The Axis powers had been materially and psychologically weakened, their offensives blunted, and their ability to dictate campaigns curtailed. The Allies had demonstrated the power of preparation, adaptability, and resilience, turning ice, snow, and frost into strategic assets. The war had shifted irrevocably. Where once the Axis had moved with confidence across continents, they now faced the consequences of environmental miscalculation. Where once the Allies had been on the defensive, they now exploited frozen rivers, snowbound mountains, and icy seas to dictate the pace of conflict. The frozen crucible of 1943 had rewritten the rules of engagement. Ice had not merely slowed the war. It had determined who would survive, who would retreat, and who would be broken. Morale, politics, and human endurance became intertwined with strategy, shaping the outcomes of campaigns across multiple theaters. The Allies' mastery of these conditions marked the beginning of a new phase in the war, one in which adaptability, patience, and the ability to endure the harshest environments would define the path to victory. The winter of 1943 revealed a truth that transcended military doctrine. War is fought not only with weapons, but with endurance, adaptation, and an understanding of the environment itself. Ice, snow, and frost were not passive backdrops. They were active participants, shaping decisions, dictating movement, and determining outcomes. The Allied ability to endure, to plan meticulously, and to exploit frozen terrain turned a season of extreme hardship into a turning point that would echo through the remainder of the war. Stalingrad, with its frozen streets and encircled battalions, became more than a battle. It became a lesson in human resilience. Soldiers endured suffering beyond imagination, yet it was their capacity to withstand extreme cold, hunger, and exhaustion that ultimately tipped the scales. Across Italy's icy mountain passes, in Arctic convoys battered by frost and enemy fire, and along frozen rivers of the Eastern Front, the Allies transformed nature's obstacles into instruments of strategy. Ice was both adversary and ally, a silent force that punished the unprepared and elevated the disciplined, the resilient and the adaptable. The Axis, for all its mechanized brilliance and tactical acumen, had underestimated the power of winter. Misjudged terrain, overextended supply lines, and the physical toll of frozen landscapes exposed vulnerabilities that no amount of firepower could compensate. In 1943, the cold revealed the limits of conventional strategy and the supremacy of preparation, endurance, and human ingenuity. Yet beyond the statistics and victories, the frozen campaigns leave a deeper reflection. The natural world has a quiet authority over human ambition. Mountains, rivers, and ice do not bend to doctrine. They impose their own conditions. History remembers not only the battles and the commanders, but also the silent, shaping force of the environment and the human capacity to endure it. The Allied miracle of 1943 was therefore a miracle not just of strategy or numbers, but of survival, adaptation, and a harmonious exploitation of nature. In the bitter cold of winter, humanity learned a lesson as old as warfare itself. Victory belongs to those who respect, endure, and harness the forces they cannot control. Ice, relentless and impartial, had decided the fate of empires, and in doing so, reshaped the course of history.